In 1841, along the suffocating banks of the Mississippi River, the Beaumont sugar plantation became the heart of a darkness that would bleed into the very soul of Louisiana. They say the devil came to dance in the cypress swamps that year, but the truth is, he never left. He was already there, living inside the grand house, behind the grieving black veil of the widow Eleanora Beaumont. She was a woman carved from marble and shadow, her grief a weapon she wielded with terrifying precision. After her husband, Jean-Pierre, died under circumstances the parish doctor refused to discuss publicly, Eleanora inherited a mountain of debt that threatened to swallow the Beaumont legacy whole. The sugar cane grew thin, the profits withered, and the creditors from New Orleans circled like vultures. But Eleanora was not the type to surrender. She was the type to sacrifice, to burn down the world to save her gilded cage. And locked away on the third floor of her decaying mansion was the one secret she believed could be her salvation, or her damnation. Her daughter Cecile, a girl born into darkness, blind since birth, and completely hidden from the world. A ghost in her own home. You see, in the eyes of Louisiana society, a blind daughter was a tragic liability, a drain on resources, unmarriageable. But Eleanora, she didn't see a daughter. She saw an asset, a key. She had discovered a secret in her late husband's legal papers, a loophole in the Code Noir so perverse, so morally bankrupt, that it was spoken of only in whispers by the most depraved lawyers in the French Quarter. A way to turn her own blood into property, a way to create something, or someone, so unique, so forbidden, that wealthy collectors would pay a fortune in gold to possess it. And so, with the stench of ruin in the air, Eleanora Beaumont began her descent. She wasn't just planning to save her plantation. She was planning to commit a sin so profound it would leave a permanent stain on the land itself. Eleanora's plan required more than just cruelty. It required accomplices who had already sold their souls. Her first letter, sealed with black wax, traveled downriver to New Orleans. It was addressed to Dr. Alistair Finch, a physician whose reputation had been shattered by rumors of grotesque experiments and an addiction to laudanum. Finch was a man drowning in his own disgrace, desperate for any lifeline that would pull him back to the surface of respectable society, even if that lifeline was woven from pure evil. He had signed Jean-Pierre Beaumont's death certificate, listing the cause as a sudden fever, when whispers in the slave quarters spoke of poison. Eleanora knew he was a man who understood the value of a well-placed lie. Her second letter found its way to a parish clerk named Silas Croft, a small, sweating man who haunted the back rooms of the courthouse. Silas had a taste for gambling he couldn't afford, and his debts to dangerous men in the city were growing. He had the power to alter records, to backdate documents, to make the impossible appear legally sound. For the right price, Silas could erase a person's history and write them a new one, a much darker one. The final raven flew to Jean Lafitte's old stomping grounds, to a man known only as the Broker, a dealer in human flesh who specialized in acquisitions of a particular nature. He found buyers for light-skinned beauties, for children with unusual eyes, for people whose tragic stories made them valuable curiosities for the ultra-wealthy. He operated from a discreet office in the French Quarter, a place that smelled of stale cigars and quiet desperation. Eleanora's proposal to these three men was simple and monstrous. She offered them absolution from their debts, a fortune in shared profits, and a return to the power they craved. All they had to do was help her perform a legal alchemy, to transform her free, white, blind daughter into something else entirely. To reclassify her on paper as a slave, because under Louisiana law, the child follows the condition of the mother. If Cecile was legally a slave, her child would be born as property, and a child born of such a twisted union, with documented white ancestry yet legally enslaved, that child would be priceless. A whispered historical rumor. It was said that Eleanora Beaumont never shed a single tear at her husband's funeral. While others wept, she stood by the fresh grave, her face hidden by a veil, and watched the dirt cover the coffin with an unnerving stillness. The slaves on the plantation said she wasn't mourning a loss but finalizing a transaction. Jean-Pierre had been a weak man, a gambler who had nearly bankrupted them. His death wasn't a tragedy. It was the removal of an obstacle. With him gone, Eleanora was free to implement a plan of her own making, a strategy far bolder and more ruthless than he could have ever conceived. The silence from the doctor, the speed of the burial, it all pointed to a truth the community was too afraid to voice. that the widow of Beaumont Plantation was not a victim of fate, but its master. She didn't just inherit her husband's debts. She inherited his power, and she intended to use it in ways that would make even the most hardened men of Louisiana shudder. This wasn't just about saving an estate. It was about forging a new legacy from the ashes of the old one, a legacy built on a secret that could only be paid for in blood and gold. Honestly, what would you do if you were backed into a corner like that? If you stood to lose everything your family had built for generations? It's a terrifying question, isn't it? The line between survival and monstrosity is often thinner than we'd like to believe. For Eleonora, that line had already been crossed. She was now walking in a territory where morality was a luxury she could no longer afford, and the only thing that mattered was the cold, hard mathematics of her salvation. She was transforming her grief into a tool, sharpening it into a blade she would soon press against the throat of her own child. The psychological architecture of the plan began not with violence, but with a subtle, terrifying shift in routine. Cecile, the blind daughter, had lived her entire life on the third floor. Her world was a map of textures and sounds. The cool smoothness of the mahogany banister, the specific creak of the fifth floorboard from the door, the distant chime of the grandfather clock in the foyer. This was her prison, but it was also her sanctuary. Her only human contact was Tante Hélène, an enslaved woman who had raised her since birth, who had taught her the names of birds she would never see and the feel of sunlight on her skin. Hélène was her eyes, her confidant, her only source of warmth in a cold, silent house. Eleonora shattered that world with a single command. Cecile was to dine with her mother in the grand dining hall every evening. The journey down 2 flights of stairs was a terrifying ordeal for a girl who had never been forced to navigate the wider spaces of the mansion. Hélène guided her, her hand a steady presence on Cecile's arm, but the girl could feel the change in the air. The house felt different, predatory. During these dinners, Eleonora spoke to her daughter, not of love or comfort, but of duty, of legacy. She painted a grim picture of their impending ruin, of the shame that would befall the Beaumont name. She spoke of a great sacrifice that was needed, a noble act that only Cecile could perform to save them all. The words were abstract, cloaked in the language of honor and family, but they were heavy with unspoken threat. Cecile, desperate for her mother's approval, for any sign of affection, listened intently. She couldn't see the cold, calculating look in Eleonora's eyes. She couldn't see the way her mother was studying her, evaluating her, like a farmer inspecting livestock before the slaughter. Eleonora was grooming her daughter, conditioning her for the horror to come, wrapping the chains of psychological control in the silken ribbons of filial duty. While Cecile was being slowly accustomed to the idea of sacrifice, Eleonora began her selection. She walked through the slave quarters with the detached air of a queen reviewing her assets. But she wasn't looking for the strongest backs for the cane fields. She was looking for specific genetic traits: height, symmetrical features, lighter skin, a trait that commanded a higher price at auction. She reviewed the breeding records her husband had kept with a chillingly meticulous hand. Documents that traced bloodlines, noted physical attributes, and calculated the monetary value of future offspring. This was the grotesque science of the slavery business, a world where human beings were reduced to a collection of profitable characteristics. She chose 12 men. They were young, strong, and in her estimation, docile enough to be controlled. One was a stable hand named Marcus, known for his startlingly blue eyes, a legacy from a long-forgotten Irish overseer. Another was Joseph, a carpenter whose skill with his hands was matched by a quiet intelligence that made Eleonora both value and fear him. These men were pulled from their routines, separated from their families, and moved to a secluded part of the plantation. They were given better food, lighter work, and new clothes. This sudden, unexplained favor was not a blessing. It was a terrifying omen. In the world of the plantation, such changes never meant anything good. They meant you were being fattened for sale or prepared for something worse. The rest of the enslaved community watched in fearful silence. Whispers slithered through the quarters at night. What was the widow planning? Why these specific men? They knew something unnatural was unfolding in the great house, a secret that felt heavy and suffocating, like the humid summer air before a hurricane. The 12 chosen men lived in a state of anxious uncertainty, caught in the invisible web of Eleonora's ambition, waiting for the day the spider would finally descend. They had no idea they were to become unwitting instruments in the violation of their master's own daughter. A child born to a slave is a slave, though the father be a king. This was not just a saying. It was a chilling legal principle enshrined in the laws governing the American South. This single sentence was the fulcrum upon which Eleanora Beaumont's entire monstrous plan pivoted. It was a loophole in the fabric of humanity itself, a legal fiction that allowed men and women of conscience to participate in a system of unimaginable cruelty. For Eleanora, it was a tool as cold and practical as a surgeon's scalpel. In the dead of night, in her late husband's study, she met with Silas Croft, the parish clerk. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and bourbon. By the flickering light of a whale oil lamp, they mapped out the fraudulent paper trail that would strip Cécile of her identity. Silas, his hands trembling slightly, explained the process. They would need to create a new birth record for Cécile, one that listed her mother as an unknown enslaved woman who had conveniently died in childbirth years ago, a ghost from the past named Marie. This new document, backdated and signed by the disgraced Dr. Finch, would be subtly swapped with the real one in the parish archives. Silas would ensure the original vanished forever. They would then create a bill of sale, also backdated, showing that Eleanora had purchased this infant Cécile out of some feigned act of charity. It was a fiction, but a legally airtight one. Once these documents were in place, Cécile Beaumont, the free-born daughter of a wealthy landowner, would cease to exist. In her place would be Cécile, the property of Eleanora Beaumont. And any child she bore would be born into that same legal darkness, forever bound to the chains of slavery. Can you imagine that? The sheer audacity. To erase your own child's existence with ink and paper, to condemn your own grandchild to a life of bondage before they even drew their first breath. This wasn't just a crime, it was a perversion of nature itself. The world of Cécile Beaumont was a symphony of the unseen. It was the oppressive humidity that clung to her skin, telling her a storm was coming. It was the scent of night-blooming jasmine drifting through the shutters, a fragrance both sweet and funereal. It was the faint vibration in the floorboards that signaled her mother's approach, a footstep heavier, more deliberate than Tante Hélène's soft, careful tread. The third floor was her entire universe, a cage meticulously designed to keep the world out and to keep her in. The windows were always shuttered, not just to block a view she could never see, but to prevent anyone from seeing in. She was the Beaumont family's secret shame, a flawed creation in a society that valued perfection above all else. Hélène had tried to give her a world beyond the darkness. She brought her silks from New Orleans so Cécile could feel the different textures. She described the vibrant colors of the Mardi Gras parades in such vivid detail that Cécile could almost see the purples, greens, and golds dancing behind her eyelids. She secretly taught Cécile to read Braille using a set of carved wooden blocks she had painstakingly made herself, a forbidden knowledge that gave Cécile a window into other worlds through stories. But now that universe was being systematically dismantled. Her mother's presence downstairs was a constant, unnerving hum. The weekly dinners were exercises in psychological torment, with Eleanora's voice, usually so clipped and distant, now dripping with a strange, predatory warmth. She spoke of Cécile's special purpose, her divine role in the family's survival. Cécile, who had yearned for her mother's love her entire life, began to see this terrifying new attention as the affection she had always craved. She was a moth drawn to a flame she could not see, unaware that the warmth she felt was the heat of her own impending immolation. Hélène watched this manipulation with a heart full of cold dread, knowing she was powerless to stop it. To speak out would mean being sold downriver, away from the girl she had raised as her own. And so she remained silent, a helpless witness to the slow, methodical poisoning of an innocent mind. The conspirators moved like shadows in the periphery of Beaumont society. Dr. Finch began making regular visits to the plantation, his carriage arriving under the cloak of dusk. To any curious neighbors, it was merely a physician attending to the well-being of the frail blind daughter. But his visits were not for healing. He performed clinical examinations, documenting Cécile's physical maturity with a chilling detachment in his medical ledger. He was not treating a patient. He was assessing the viability of a vessel. He noted her health, her strength, her suitability for childbearing, all while speaking to her in soothing, condescending tones that masked the monstrous purpose of his touch. He was a man of science, he told himself, merely observing and recording facts. The morality of the situation was not his concern. His fee, paid in gold coins that felt heavy with sin, was his only concern. Meanwhile, Silas Croft was at work in the dusty archives of the parish courthouse. Late at night, long after the other clerks had gone home, he would unseal the official record books. With painstaking care, he practiced forging the handwriting of the clerk from 17 years prior. He treated the old paper with tea and smoke to age it artificially. He was an artist of deceit, and the falsified documents he created were masterpieces of fraud. The new birth certificate, the bill of sale, they looked utterly authentic, their lies baked into the very fiber of the paper. Each stroke of his pen was an act of erasure, wiping away one life and creating another. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple as he worked, the silence of the courthouse amplifying the frantic beating of his own heart. He knew that if this was ever discovered, he would hang. But the thought of the money, of paying off his debts and walking with his head held high again, was a more powerful motivator than the fear of the noose. The broker in New Orleans was also busy, cultivating his market. He sent coded letters to his most discerning clients, a wealthy sugar baron in Cuba, a morally bankrupt senator in Virginia, and a reclusive cotton king in Mississippi, known for his collection of human oddities. He didn't sell them a person. He sold them a story, a myth. He wrote of a one-of-a-kind acquisition that would soon be available. A child of mysterious and tragic origins, with documented noble bloodlines yet born into servitude. He was creating a demand, stoking the fires of desire and vanity among men who had everything, and therefore wanted the one thing no one else could have. He was a master marketer, and his product was a human soul. By the spring of 1842, the trap was set. Cecile, now 18, was deemed ready by Dr. Finch. She had been fully conditioned by her mother, brought to a state of mind where she believed that submitting to her mother's will was the highest form of love and duty. She didn't understand the mechanics of what was to come, her isolation having kept her profoundly ignorant of the world, but she understood that her body was no longer her own. It belonged to the legacy of the Beaumont family. The events that followed were a stain on the history of the plantation, a period of darkness so profound that even the earth itself seemed to recoil. The 12 men, one by one, were brought into the great house. They were not told why. They were simply ordered. To refuse was not an option. Refusal meant the whipping post, the selling block, the separation from family, or worse. They were trapped, forced participants in a horror they could not comprehend, their own humanity stripped away as they were used as instruments against another victim. Dante. Hélène was a prisoner in her own small room, locked in whenever one of the men was brought upstairs. She could only listen to the terrifying silence, to the sounds of a world being torn apart. She would press her ear to the door, her body trembling, praying for an end that would not come. The psychological toll was immense. The men returned to their quarters hollowed out, their eyes vacant. They couldn't speak of what happened, not to each other, not to their families. A wall of silence, built of fear and shame, descended upon the plantation. The air grew thick with unspoken trauma, a poison that seeped into the soil, into the water, into the very roots of the sugar cane. Eleonora oversaw it all with an icy calm. This was not an act of passion or cruelty in her mind. It was a business transaction. It was the calculated, methodical execution of a plan designed to ensure her survival. She had successfully turned the most sacred of human acts into a cold, ugly, and profitable enterprise. She was not a mother. She was a manufacturer, and her daughter was simply the machinery. A disturbing real-world quote to consider. From the writings of a 19th-century sociologist studying the slave economy, the institution of slavery is a machine for extracting labor and creating capital. It redefines all human relationships, parent to child, husband to wife, in terms of ownership and value. In such a system, the most monstrous acts can be rationalized, not as sins, but as sound business decisions. This is the key to understanding a mind like Eleonora Beaumont's. She was not operating outside the logic of her time. She was its most perfect and terrifying product. The system had already taught her that people could be property, that their bodies could be used to generate wealth, that their offspring could be entered into a ledger like livestock. Her crime was not in inventing this logic, but in applying it to her own flesh and blood. She pushed the established principles of slavery to their most extreme and horrifying conclusion. She saw no moral difference between breeding two of her strongest field hands to produce a valuable worker and using her daughter to produce a unique, high-value collectible. The principle was the same. The only difference was the proximity of the bloodline, a sentimental detail she had long since discarded as irrelevant. You have to understand this to grasp the full horror of the story. Eleonora was not a madwoman, not in the clinical sense. She was a rational actor within an insane system. Her plan, while monstrous to us, was, by the twisted reasoning of her world, simply an innovative and ruthless business strategy. And that perhaps is the most terrifying part of all. The evil wasn't an aberration. It was the system itself, distilled into its purest, most potent form, and embodied in one woman's unbreakable will to survive. By late summer, Dr. Finch confirmed what Eleonora had been waiting for. Cecile was pregnant. The first phase of the plan was complete. The machinery was now in motion. A strange, suffocating quiet fell over the Beaumont plantation. The 12 men who had been used were now a liability. They were living evidence of the conspiracy. One by one they began to disappear. Eleonora sold them, not at the large public auctions in New Orleans, but through discreet private sales arranged by the broker. She scattered them across the South, to cotton plantations in Alabama, to rice fields in the Carolinas, to a brutal sugar mill in the West Indies. She severed their connections to the land, to their families, to each other. She was erasing the witnesses, ensuring that their fragmented knowledge could never be pieced together to form a coherent accusation. Marcus, the man with the blue eyes, was sold to a notoriously cruel master in Texas, never to be heard from again. Joseph, the carpenter, was sent to a turpentine camp in Florida, a place from which few men returned. Each sale was another layer of earth shoveled onto the secret, burying it deeper and deeper. The enslaved community felt these losses like phantom limbs. Husbands, sons, and brothers vanished without a word of goodbye. The grief was silent and profound, a communal wound that could not be shown for fear of the whip. They knew, in the way that the oppressed always know, that these disappearances were connected to the strange happenings in the great house, to the prolonged sickness of the blind daughter on the 3rd floor. They just didn't know how. Tante Hélène watched the men being led away in chains, and a cold certainty settled in her heart. She was a witness too, and she knew, with a terrifying clarity, that her turn would come. She was living on borrowed time. Cecile's pregnancy was a time of profound confusion and terror. Her body was changing in ways Hélène tried desperately to explain in soft, hushed tones, but the explanations made no sense to a girl who had no context for them. The life growing inside her was not a source of joy. It was an alien presence, a physical manifestation of the violation she had endured. She spent her days in darkness, her hands resting on her swelling belly, trying to understand what was happening to her. She had episodes of deep despair, followed by periods of vacant, unnerving calm. The laudanum that Dr. Finch prescribed kept her in a hazy fog, blurring the edges of her reality and her nightmares. Eleonora managed the pregnancy with the same cold efficiency she managed her sugarcane production. She monitored Cecile's diet, her exercise, her sleep. She was cultivating her crop. The child was not her grandchild. It was her salvation, the golden ticket that would pull the Beaumont name back from the abyss. She never spoke to Cecile about the baby. She never offered a word of comfort or maternal guidance. Her interactions remained focused on duty, on the great service Cecile was performing for the family. One afternoon, a new priest from a neighboring parish, Father Michael, made an unannounced visit. He was a young, earnest man from Ireland, not yet hardened by the moral compromises of Louisiana. He had heard whispers of the reclusive blind daughter and wanted to offer spiritual counsel. Eleonora met him at the door, her face a mask of polite grief. She explained that Cecile was suffering from a nervous condition, a female hysteria that made her prone to delusions and unfit for visitors. Father Michael, however, was persistent. He felt a spiritual unease about the house, a sense of profound sorrow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He pressed the issue, suggesting that prayer might be the very thing the girl needed. Eleonora's eyes narrowed, her polite facade cracking for just a second. "Father," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "some secrets are between a family and God. I would advise you not to place yourself between them. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. Father Michael left that day, but the encounter had shaken Eleonora. The secret was fragile. It required absolute control. She realized then that once the child was born and sold, Cecile herself would become the final liability. The broker in New Orleans began the final stage of his work, the auction. But this was no ordinary auction held in the open air of a public square. This was a silent auction, conducted through sealed letters delivered by trusted couriers. The item for sale was described in lavish, poetic detail. A male infant, born of a line of pristine European nobility, yet legally classified as chattel through a unique and tragic turn of fate. An object of unparalleled rarity, guaranteed to be the centerpiece of any discerning collector's household. The description was a masterpiece of coded language, designed to appeal to the vanity and perversity of his clientele. The starting bid was set at $5,000, an astronomical sum for any enslaved person, let alone an infant. But this was not about labor. This was about status. This was about possessing something no one else could own. The letters went out to the 3 pre-selected buyers. The senator in Virginia, whose political ambitions required a constant display of wealth. The sugar baron in Cuba, a man known for his decadent and often cruel tastes. And the cotton king in Mississippi, a deeply reclusive and eccentric man named Julian Croft, no relation to Silas, who lived on a massive, isolated estate and was rumored to collect human beings the way other men collected art. The bids began to trickle back. The senator offered $5,000. The Cuban baron raised it to $6,000. Julian Croft, the man from Mississippi, did not bother with increments. His letter contained a single sentence, 10,000 in gold coin, delivered upon my personal inspection and satisfaction. The child is to be mine and mine alone. The sum was staggering. It was more than enough to clear all of Eleonora's debts and restore the Beaumont plantation to its former glory for decades to come. The broker immediately sent a messenger to Eleonora. They had found their buyer. Now all they had to do was wait for the product to be delivered. The fate of the unborn child was sealed. He had been sold for a king's ransom before he had even taken his first breath. In the final weeks of the pregnancy, a hurricane gathered in the Gulf, a monstrous swirling vortex of wind and water. As the storm churned toward the Louisiana coast, it felt like a physical manifestation of the moral storm raging within the Beaumont house. The sky turned a sickly yellow-green, and the air grew so heavy it was difficult to breathe. The slaves whispered that the land itself was angry, that God was sending a storm to wash away the sin that had taken root there. As the winds began to howl and the rain came down in blinding sheets, Cecile went into labor. The birth was a brutal, agonizing ordeal, lasting for nearly 2 days, mirroring the fury of the storm outside. Dr. Finch, trapped at the plantation by the weather, worked with a grim determination, his usual detachment shaken by the primeval violence of both the birth and the hurricane. Tante Hélène was allowed to be there, to hold Cecile's hand and wipe her brow, a small act of humanity in a moment of profound inhumanity. Eleonora was also present, not as a supportive mother, but as an overseer, watching her investment come to fruition. In the pre-dawn hours of the second day, as the eye of the hurricane passed over the plantation, creating a pocket of eerie calm, the child was born. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with skin the color of pale café au lait and a shock of dark, curly hair. For a single breathtaking moment, there was a sense of peace in the room. Cecile, exhausted and delirious, heard his first cry, and a flicker of something, a primal maternal instinct, broke through the fog of her trauma. "Let me hold him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please," Eleonora stepped forward. "No," she said, her voice as cold and calm as the eye of the storm. "That will not be possible." She took the infant from the doctor, wrapped him in a clean linen, and carried him out of the room, leaving Cecile alone with the sound of her own quiet weeping and the returning roar of the hurricane's winds. The transaction was almost complete. You're not just watching this, you're becoming part of it. The moment you chose to click on this story, you stepped out of your world and into this one. You're standing in the shadows of that birthing room. You're feeling the oppressive humidity. You're hearing the winds of the hurricane lash against the windows. Can you feel the injustice? The sheer soul-crushing weight of it? This isn't just a tale from a dusty history book. It's a testament to the darkness that humans are capable of. A darkness that doesn't just vanish with time. It lingers. It mutates. It finds new forms. The story of the Beaumont plantation is not over. The most chilling parts are yet to come. The aftermath of such a profound sin is often more terrifying than the act itself. If you've come this far, you're not a passive observer anymore. You are a witness, and what you do with this knowledge matters. Let the story sink in. Let it make you uncomfortable. That discomfort is a sign that your humanity is still intact. Comment "I am a witness" below to let me know you're still here, still bearing witness to the truth no matter how dark it gets. Because what happened next at the Beaumont plantation would prove that saving a legacy and destroying a soul are often one and the same. The gold had been secured, but the price was about to be paid in a currency far more valuable than money. The land itself was about to demand its due. The moment the storm broke, Silas Croft, the parish clerk, arrived at the plantation. He carried a leather satchel containing the official parish seal and a set of freshly forged documents. In the dim light of Eleanora's study, surrounded by the debris the hurricane had left behind, broken branches, shattered panes of glass, they finalized the legal fiction. Dr. Finch was there, his hands still stained from the delivery. He, Eleanora, and Silas became the three unholy pillars of the lie. The birth certificate was filled out. Name unlisted male. Mother, Marie, enslaved, deceased. Father, unknown. Property of Eleanora Beaumont. Silas pressed the official parish seal into the warm wax, and with that simple physical act, a human life was legally defined as a piece of property. The child, who should have been an heir, was now, by law, a thing to be bought and sold. They gave him a name, not a family name, but a simple one-word designation, Amadou. It meant love of God in a language none of them understood, a bitter cosmic irony that was lost on them all. Amadou was handed over to a wet nurse, an enslaved woman named Rose, who had recently lost her own infant to fever. Rose was ordered to care for the child, but forbidden from showing him any true affection. He was not a baby to be loved. He was merchandise to be kept in pristine condition before delivery to the buyer. Cecile, confined to her room on the 3rd floor, was slowly recovering from the physical trauma of childbirth. But her mind was beginning to fracture. She could hear the baby crying in a distant part of the house. The sound was a phantom limb, an ache for something she had held within her but was never allowed to touch. She would ask Hélène over and over, "Is he well? Does he have my hair?" Hélène could only offer vague, comforting lies, each word a betrayal that chipped away at her own soul. The house was now divided into spheres of impossible suffering. Cécile, the ghost mother, haunted by the cries of a child she couldn't see. Rose, the grieving mother forced to nurse the cause of her mistress's salvation. And Tante Hélène, the silent witness, trapped between them all. Her heart breaking for both of them. 2 weeks after the birth, a grand black carriage, drawn by 4 perfectly matched gray horses, made its way up the long, oak-lined drive to the Beaumont mansion. Julian Croft, the reclusive cotton king from Mississippi, had arrived to inspect his purchase. He was a tall, unnaturally thin man dressed in immaculate black silk. His face was pale and gaunt, dominated by eyes so dark they seemed to drink the light from the room. He moved with a languid grace that was both elegant and deeply unsettling. He was not a man who commanded with a loud voice. He commanded with an unnerving, predatory stillness. Eleanor received him in the grand parlor. They spoke for an hour about the price of cotton, about the recent storm, about mutual acquaintances in New Orleans. It was a delicate dance of pleasantries, a civilized veneer stretched thin over a grotesque transaction. Finally, Croft leaned forward, a thin smile playing on his lips. "I believe you have something for me, Madame Beaumont." Eleanora rang a small silver bell, and Rose entered, carrying the infant Amadou. Croft did not reach for the child. He simply observed him, his dark eyes scanning the baby with the critical gaze of a connoisseur, examining a rare porcelain vase. He instructed Rose to unwrap the blankets. He inspected the child's hands, his feet, the color of his skin. He was looking for imperfections, for any sign that the product was not as advertised. "The documentation?" he asked, his voice a dry whisper. Eleanor produced the folder containing the forged birth certificate and the bill of sale, all legally certified by Silas Croft. Julian Croft reviewed the papers slowly, his thin fingers tracing the lines of ink. He was not just buying a child. He was buying a story, a legal reality that would protect his investment. Excellent, he finally said, looking up at Eleonora. The story is compelling. A servant entered, carrying a heavy wooden chest. He opened it on the table, revealing stacks of gleaming gold coins. $10,000. The sight of it was breathtaking. It was the physical manifestation of Eleonora's sin, the price of her daughter's womb and her grandson's freedom. The transaction was concluded with a handshake. The gold was counted and secured in Eleonora's safe. Amadou, the infant, was handed over to Julian Croft's own wet nurse, a stern-faced woman who had traveled with him. Cécile, on the third floor, heard the commotion of the carriage, the horses, the voices in the foyer. Tante Hélène stood by the window, watching the black carriage pull away, carrying the baby with it. She turned to Cécile, her face a mask of grief. "He is gone," she said softly. "The man from Mississippi has taken him." Cécile did not cry. She did not scream. She simply lay still, her sightless eyes fixed on the ceiling. A part of her had been amputated, and the shock was too great for tears. The part of her that had held onto a sliver of hope, the part that had dared to dream of holding her child, had just died. From that moment on, something inside her changed irrevocably. The quiet, gentle girl was gone, replaced by something broken and unpredictable. The first sign was the laughter. In the middle of the night, a high, unearthly laughter would echo from the third floor, a sound devoid of joy, full of a chilling, empty madness. Then came the screaming fits, violent and sudden, followed by long periods of catatonic silence, where she would not eat, or speak, or move. Dr. Finch was called again. His diagnosis was swift, a severe case of postpartum hysteria, exacerbated by her nervous condition. His prescription was more laudanum, enough to keep her in a perpetual state of drugged stupor. Eleonora accepted the diagnosis without question. A mad daughter was easier to control than a grieving one. A mad daughter's testimony, should she ever speak of what happened, would be dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. In a twisted way, Cécile's descent into madness served to protect the secret, adding another layer of security to the conspiracy. The gold was safe in the vault, and the final living proof of the crime was now being locked away in the prison of her own shattered mind. With the Beaumont debts cleared, a strange and unnatural prosperity returned to the plantation. The fields were revitalized, the great house was repaired and repainted, and Eleonora resumed her place in high society. She hosted lavish parties, her home once again a beacon of wealth and influence on the river road. To the outside world, she was the heroic widow who had single-handedly saved her family's legacy from ruin, a pillar of strength and resilience. But within the walls of the mansion, a deep and pervasive rot had set in. The house, despite its new paint and polished silver, felt cold and empty. A profound sorrow seemed to cling to the curtains and seep from the floorboards. The slaves moved with a heavy, listless energy, their songs quieter, their spirits broken by the weight of the secrets they were forced to keep. Eleonora had saved the body of the plantation, but she had murdered its soul. Tante Hélène became the sole keeper of Cécile's broken world. She cared for the mad girl on the third floor, a girl who now existed in a fractured reality of whispers and phantoms. Some days, Cécile would be lucid, weeping quietly for a son whose face she had never seen. On other days, she was violent, lashing out at shadows, her screams echoing through the house. One day, Eleonora came to the third floor. She found Hélène brushing Cécile's hair as the girl hummed a tuneless, empty lullaby. "She has become a burden," Eleonora stated, not as a mother expressing sorrow, but as a manager identifying a problem. "She knows too much. She is a threat." Hélène's blood ran cold. She knew what those words meant. "She is your daughter," Hélène whispered, her voice trembling. "She is a complication," Eleonora corrected her. "And complications must be dealt with." Eleonora was already formulating the next phase of her plan. The witnesses had been scattered. The evidence was buried in the parish archives. Now the final two pieces of the puzzle remained, the mad girl on the third floor and the loyal servant who knew everything. Both of them had to be silenced, permanently. Another whispered rumor from the time. A story told by riverboat captains and traveling merchants. They said that after 1842, the sugar from the Beaumont plantation tasted different. It was still sweet, but there was a bitter metallic aftertaste, something that lingered on the tongue like regret. Some said it was a blight in the soil. Others, more superstitious, said the land was cursed, that the tears of the ghost on the third floor had seeped into the ground and poisoned the cane. The Beaumont sugar, once prized, began to fetch a lower price at the New Orleans exchange. It was as if the earth itself was rejecting the blood money that had revitalized it. This is how the secret began to destroy Louisiana. Not in a blaze of fire or a clap of thunder, but in a slow, insidious decay. It was a poison that started in one household and began to seep into the economy, into the culture, into the very land. The Beaumont fortune was rebuilt on a foundation of lies, and that foundation was beginning to crack. The darkness couldn't be contained within the walls of the mansion. It was leaking out, a miasma of corruption that tainted everything it touched. Eleonora could polish her silver and host her parties, but she couldn't escape the fundamental truth. You cannot build a lasting legacy on a buried crime. The past doesn't stay buried, it rots, and that rot eventually rises to the surface, breaking through the pristine white paint and manicured lawns, reminding everyone of the horror that lies just beneath their feet. The bitter sugar was a prophecy, a sign that the House of Beaumont, and the system that allowed it to flourish, was doomed to collapse under the weight of its own sins. The end for Tante Hélène came swiftly and without warning. One morning, Eleonora informed her that she was being rewarded for her years of loyal service. She was being granted her freedom. But this was not an act of kindness. It was a sentence of exile. Hélène was to be sent to a special community for freed slaves in the north, a place from which she could never return. She was given 1 hour to pack her belongings. She was not allowed to say goodbye to Cécile. As she was escorted from the house, she caught one last glimpse of the third-floor window. She knew she was abandoning the girl she loved to a terrible fate, but she was powerless. Her freedom was just another kind of chain, one that dragged her away from the only person she had left to protect. "You will speak of this to no one," Eleonora warned her at the gate, pressing a small bag of coins into her hand. "Hush money. If you do, the life of your sister's family in New Orleans will be forfeit." The threat was clear. Hélène's silence was bought with the lives of her family. She was put on a carriage and sent away, her knowledge and her grief silenced forever. With Hélène gone, Cécile was left utterly alone, attended now by 2 new servants who were instructed to keep her sedated and confined. She was no longer a person. She was a dangerous object to be managed. Eleonora then turned her attention to her daughter. She couldn't sell her. She couldn't kill her outright. That would raise too many questions. So she chose a different kind of death. She began circulating rumors in society about Cécile's violent madness. She spoke with heartbreaking, feigned sorrow about how her daughter had become a danger to herself and others. She was laying the groundwork for the final solution. She arranged for Dr. Finch to sign a commitment order declaring Cécile legally insane and in need of permanent institutional care. The institution she chose was not a gentle asylum. It was a notorious place on the outskirts of the state, a dumping ground for the inconvenient and the insane, a place from which no one ever returned. It was a prison designed to erase people. Cécile was taken away on a dark, moonless night. There was no struggle. She was so heavily drugged with laudanum that she was barely conscious. They carried her out of the house like a sack of grain and placed her in an unmarked carriage. As they rolled down the long driveway, past the fields of bitter sugar cane, Cécile had a moment of lucidity. The fog in her mind cleared for just an instant, and she understood. She was being erased. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She had nothing left to fight with. Her body, her child, and her sanity had already been taken from her. All she had left was her name, and now that was being stolen too. She arrived at the asylum as Jane Doe, a nameless, insane woman with no history and no family. The last thread connecting her to the world was cut. Eleonora Beaumont had achieved her final victory. Every witness was gone. Every piece of evidence was buried or discredited. Her secret was safe. She was the sole architect and survivor of her own perfect crime. She stood on the veranda of her grand mansion, the master of her restored kingdom, and watched the sunrise. She had sacrificed everything and everyone to save her legacy. She had paid the ultimate price, using the bodies and souls of others, and she had won. Or so she thought. But there is a strange and terrible justice in the world. Sins of this magnitude do not go unpunished. The punishment is just rarely what we expect. Eleonora believed she had silenced the past, but the past was not silent. It was waiting. It was patient. and its vengeance would come not from the law or from the church, but from the very bloodline she had sought to control. Years turned into decades. Eleanora Beaumont grew old, a lonely, iron-willed matriarch ruling over her empty mansion. She never remarried. She never had another child. Her life was a monument to her own ruthless ambition. She died in 1871, a wealthy and respected woman who was mourned by a society that had no idea of the monster that lived behind her grieving widow's veil. The plantation passed to a distant cousin, and the story of the blind daughter and the secret child faded into the mists of local legend, a ghost story told to frighten children. The truth, it seemed, was buried forever. But let's travel forward in time, to 1935. The Great Depression has its grip on the nation. A young historian from the Works Progress Administration, a man named Thomas Martin, is assigned to the Louisiana Writers Project, tasked with documenting the oral histories of former slaves and the folklore of the rural parishes. He is a meticulous, passionate researcher, driven by a desire to uncover the lost stories of his state. One day he finds himself in a dusty, neglected corner of the state archives in Baton Rouge. He is looking for records on the Beaumont Plantation for a piece he is writing on the sugar economy. He stumbles upon a box of old, water-damaged court records from the 1840s, records that were thought to have been destroyed in a courthouse fire decades earlier. Inside, his fingers brush against two documents, fused together by time and moisture. He carefully separates them. One is a birth certificate for Cécile Beaumont, daughter of Jean-Pierre and Eleanora Beaumont, born free and white in 1824. The other is a bill of sale, dated 1842 for an unnamed infant male, property of Eleanora Beaumont, sold to one Julian Croft of Mississippi. The mother of the infant is listed as Marie, an enslaved woman. The historian frowns. It's an odd coincidence of names and dates, but then he sees it. A small handwritten note in the margin of the bill of sale, scribbled by a long-dead clerk. The note says, "Mother is C.B., certified by Dr. A. Finch, C.B., Cécile Beaumont. A. Finch, Alastair Finch." The pieces click into place in his mind with the sickening finality of a coffin lid shutting. It's not a story. It's a confession. This single cryptic note sends Thomas Martin down a rabbit hole that will consume the next 10 years of his life. He becomes obsessed with the Beaumont case. He tracks down the descendants of the slaves who worked on the plantation. He finds an old woman, the great-granddaughter of a woman named Rose, who tells him a story passed down through her family, a story of a blind, mad girl on the 3rd floor, and an infant who was born during a hurricane and sold to a strange, pale man from Mississippi. He travels to the town where the asylum once stood and finds its patient records. After months of searching, he finds an entry from 1843 for a Jane Doe, admitted for severe female hysteria. Her file contains a note from the admitting physician. Patient is blind and suffers from delusions regarding a lost child. She died in the asylum in 1859. The cause of death was listed as wasting away. She had simply stopped eating. The most chilling discovery, however, comes from Mississippi. Martin learns that Julian Croft, the reclusive cotton king, died without a direct heir. His massive estate and all his property, including his human property, was broken up and sold off. But Croft was a meticulous record keeper. In his journals, which Martin uncovers in a university library, Croft writes about his collection. He speaks of Amadou, the boy he purchased from the widow Beaumont. He writes, "The boy is a remarkable specimen. The tragedy of his lineage gives him a certain poetic value. He is a living piece of art, a testament to the beautiful cruelties of which our society is capable." The journals track Amadou's life on the Mississippi plantation. He was raised not as a servant but as a curiosity. He was taught to read and play the piano, dressed in fine clothes and displayed at Croft's bizarre, infrequent social gatherings. He was a bird in a gilded cage, his life a performance for his master's amusement. And then, in 1863, at the height of the Civil War, the entries about Amadou stop. The last one simply says he is gone, vanished in the night. The chaos of this war has undone everything. Amadou, now a young man of 21, had escaped. Using the confusion of a nearby Union Army raid as cover, he slipped away from the Croft plantation and disappeared into the fog of war. He took with him the education, the refined manners, and the burning, unanswered questions about his own identity. He didn't know the truth of his birth, but he knew his existence was a lie. He knew he was not like the other slaves, and he knew Julian Croft's paternalistic affection was just the polished surface of a deep and monstrous ownership. What happened to Amadou after his escape is the final haunting piece of the puzzle. Records from the era are chaotic, but Thomas Martin, the historian, believes he found him. He found a man named Thomas Bow, a name tantalizingly close to Beaumont, who enlisted in a colored infantry regiment of the Union Army. This Thomas Bow fought with distinction at the siege of Port Hudson. After the war, he didn't stay in the South. He couldn't. The land held too many ghosts. He moved to Chicago, passed for white using his light skin and educated speech, and became a successful businessman. He married, had children, and built a new life, a new legacy on the ashes of the old one. He never spoke of his past. He never told his wife or his children that he had been born a slave, that he had been sold by his own grandmother for $10,000 in gold. He buried the secret of the Beaumont plantation just as his grandmother had, but for a different reason. She buried it to protect her wealth. He buried it to protect his freedom and his family's future. The great-grandson of Eleanora Beaumont, the man who should have inherited the sugar plantation, instead became a self-made man in the North, his success an unwitting, ironic revenge on the woman who had sold him into bondage. The bloodline had not been destroyed. It had escaped, transformed, and flourished, far from the cursed soil of Louisiana. Let's pause for a moment. If you're still with me, it means this story has taken hold of you. It's more than just a sequence of events, isn't it? It's a glimpse into the abyss. We've unraveled the crime, the cover-up, and the escape. But the story isn't over. The philosophical implications, the deep, unsettling questions this case raises about human nature, are what will stay with you long after the video ends. Think about the parallel between Eleanora and her grandson, Amadou, who became Thomas Bow. Both of them were obsessed with legacy. Eleanora sacrificed her humanity to preserve an old, corrupt legacy built on slavery. Thomas Bow erased his own history to build a new legacy, one built on freedom and reinvention. Who was more successful? Who paid the higher price? This case was never just about one family or one plantation. It was a glimpse into the darkness that lives inside the American dream itself, the foundational sin of slavery and the desperate, often brutal measures people will take to achieve wealth, status, and power. It's a story about how the past is never truly past. The secrets we bury, the crimes we rationalize, they have consequences that ripple through generations. The Beaumont poison didn't just taint the sugar. It flowed through the veins of a family, shaping destinies in ways no one could have predicted. The story is a mirror, and what we see in it should frighten us, because the same forces of greed, ambition, and dehumanization that drove Eleanora Beaumont are still at work in our world today. They just wear different masks. What truly makes this story a cornerstone of American horror is the character of Julian Croft. He is, in many ways, more terrifying than Eleanora. Eleanora acted out of a twisted form of survival, a desperate, albeit monstrous attempt to save her world. Her motives, while evil, are understandable in a primal way, but Julian Croft, his evil is aesthetic. He is the ultimate connoisseur of human suffering. He didn't buy Amadou for labor. He didn't need the money or the work. He bought him as a piece of art. He relished the poetic tragedy of the boy's existence. He saw beauty in the cruelty. This is a far more modern and insidious kind of evil. It is the evil of detachment, of turning human beings into objects of intellectual or aesthetic curiosity. Croft represents the chilling endpoint of a society built on commodification. When you can buy and sell people, it is a short leap to then treating them as collectibles, their pain and trauma adding to their market value. He wasn't just a slave owner. He was a collector of broken lives, a curator of sorrow. He found Amadou's story compelling, not horrifying. That single word reveals a soul so rotted by wealth and power that it has lost all capacity for empathy. The true horror of Julian Croft is that he saw the monstrosity of the system and, instead of being repulsed by it, he was captivated by its artistic possibilities. He was a symptom of a deeply sick society, a man for whom the ultimate luxury was not fine wine or rare paintings, but the ownership of another person's tragic story. He didn't need to use a whip to be cruel. His cruelty was in his gaze, in the way he turned a boy's life into a performance for his own private amusement. And that kind of psychological vampirism is a darkness that is truly, deeply, and eternally chilling. The final fate of the other conspirators serves as a grim footnote to the story. Dr. Alastair Finch, haunted by what he had done, drank himself to death within 5 years of Cecile's commitment. He was found in a cheap boarding house in New Orleans, surrounded by empty laudanum bottles. His medical license, the thing he had hoped to protect, was found torn to pieces in the hearth. His complicity brought him no peace, only a slow, miserable decline into the abyss he had helped create. Silas Croft, the parish clerk, took his share of the money and fled Louisiana. He was terrified that Eleonora, in her quest for absolute security, would eventually see him as a loose end to be tied. He changed his name and moved to Texas, where he tried to reinvent himself as a respectable landowner. But his luck ran out. He was killed in a poker game in 1851, stabbed over a cheating accusation. His blood money bought him less than a decade of anxious, paranoid freedom. The broker, the man who dealt in stories as much as in flesh, vanished from the records. Some say he retired wealthy and moved to Europe. Others whisper that one of his many enemies finally caught up with him on a dark New Orleans street. He was a ghost in the system, a facilitator of misery who left no trace but the suffering of the people he sold. All of them, in their own way, were consumed by the darkness they had served. They thought they could control it, take their piece of it, and walk away clean. But that kind of darkness doesn't work that way. It clings to you. It seeps into your bones. They may have died of drink or a knife or in obscurity, but the true cause of death for all of them was the Beaumont secret. It was a poison that killed not just its victims, but its perpetrators as well. Let's return to Thomas Martin, the historian who uncovered the truth. He spent his entire career piecing together this story, but he never published a formal book about it. When asked why, he gave a chilling answer. He said that the more he learned, the more he realized this wasn't an isolated case. The Beaumont conspiracy was shocking not because it was unique, but because he had found the proof. He found evidence of similar smaller-scale frauds in other parish records, cases of light-skinned slave children with unknown parentage being sold for suspiciously high prices, cases where birth records seemed to have been tampered with. He came to believe that Eleonora Beaumont wasn't an anomaly. She was just better at it, more audacious. She had perfected a quiet, profitable form of monstrousness that others were practicing in a less spectacular fashion. This is the story's final devastating turn of the screw. The horror isn't what one woman did. The horror is that she was part of a widespread, unspoken practice, a shadow economy built on the deliberate erasure of bloodlines and the theft of freedom from those who were legally entitled to it. How many other children, born to white mothers or fathers through coercion or secret affairs, were quietly reclassified and sold into slavery to cover a debt, hide a scandal, or simply turn a profit? We will never know. Their stories are lost, their records destroyed or so expertly forged that the truth is impenetrable. The Beaumont case is a window into a secret history of America, a history of thousands of ghost children whose true identities were stolen at birth. They are the ultimate victims, their very existence a crime that was systematically erased by the society that created them. The secret didn't just destroy one plantation in Louisiana. It was a cancer that had metastasized throughout the entire body of the South. So, what became of the cursed land? The Beaumont plantation, after Eleonora's death, fell into a slow, steady decline. The cousin who inherited it was a poor manager, and the yields of the bitter sugar continued to dwindle. The Civil War and the end of slavery delivered the final death blow. The land was broken up and sold off in parcels. The great house was abandoned. For years, it stood as a decaying monument to a forgotten dynasty, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the fallow fields. Locals called it the ghost house, and told stories of hearing a woman weeping on the third floor on nights when the moon was full. In the 1950s, the house finally collapsed under its own weight, its rotting timbers giving way in a cloud of dust and regret. Today, nothing is left but the foundation, a few crumbling brick pillars, and the long avenue of ancient oaks that once led to the front door. The land is now part of a chemical plant's property, a landscape of pipes and storage tanks. But workers at the plant, especially those on the night shift, still report strange occurrences. A feeling of profound sadness that washes over them near the old foundation. The faint scent of jasmine in the air, even in the middle of winter. The sound of a baby crying, carried on the wind from the direction of the river. The land remembers. The land holds the trauma in its very soil. You can build over it, pave it, cover it with industry, but you can't erase the energy of what happened there. The pain is a part of the place, a permanent stain that not even time can wash away. The Beaumont legacy was not saved. It was annihilated, its physical presence on the earth completely erased, leaving behind nothing but a poisoned patch of ground and a story that refuses to die. This brings us to the end of the chain of events, but not to the end of the story. The real story is the one that lives on, the one we are telling right now. It's a story about the nature of evil. Was Eleanor Beaumont born a monster, or was she created by her circumstances? Was her act a singular feat of wickedness, or was she simply a more efficient practitioner of the everyday evil of her time? This is the question that should haunt you. The system of slavery provided the tools, the legal framework, and the moral justification for her actions. She was a product of a world that had already declared that human beings could be less than human. Perhaps the true monster was not a single person, but the society itself, a society that placed profit above people, legacy above love, and law above justice. This case forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. Our history is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a murky, complex landscape filled with people who were both. It's a history of ordinary people who, driven by fear, greed, or ambition, became complicit in extraordinary acts of cruelty. Eleanor was not some cackling villain from a fairy tale. She was a respected member of her community. Her accomplices were doctors and lawyers, men of standing. The horror lies in their normality. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that the greatest atrocities are often committed not by monsters in the shadows, but by our neighbors, by the people we trust, by the pillars of our society. And they commit them not in fits of rage, but with calm, rational, calculated precision, believing all the while that what they are doing is not only necessary, but right. But was everything truly revealed? Or does the real story remain hidden in the shadows? We have the historian's notes, the fractured records, the oral histories, but we don't have a confession. We don't have the voice of Cécile or Tante Hélène or Amadou himself telling us their unfiltered truth. Their experiences are still mediated through the lens of others, through the imperfect record of history. What did Cécile think and feel in those final lucid moments? What were the names of the 12 men who were used and scattered, and what became of their descendants? What happened to the family of Tante Hélène, the one whose lives were used as leverage to ensure her silence? These are the questions that can never be answered, the loose threads that will forever dangle from the edge of this story. The archive is full of holes, of deliberate erasures. The silence of the victims is the final, unbreachable wall that the historian can never climb. The story we have is just the skeleton, the parts that were durable enough to survive the passage of time. The flesh, the blood, the soul of the experience that is lost forever, buried with the people who lived it. And perhaps that is where the true, enduring mystery lies. Not in what we know, but in the vast, echoing silence of what we can never know. The full truth of the Beaumont plantation is not in the historical record. It's in the ghosts that still walk that cursed piece of land by the Mississippi River. What do you think really happened in the spaces between the facts? What does this story say about the price of survival and the nature of legacy? Leave your thoughts below. This is not just a place for passive viewing. It's a forum for discussion, a place for us to grapple with the darkest corners of our shared past together. And if you believe these stories need to be told, if you believe that we can only understand our present by unearthing the most difficult parts of our past, then subscribe to The Sealed Room. Hit the notification bell, because we have so many more seals to break, so many more buried truths to uncover. Your engagement, your comments, your shares, they are the light we use to navigate these dark histories. By joining this community, you are helping to ensure that these stories and the lessons they hold are not forgotten. You are becoming part of a movement that demands we look into the abyss, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a profound need to understand the forces that have shaped our world and the darkness that may still live inside humanity itself. Because sometimes, history's darkest secrets are not buried in the past. They are not confined to old plantations or dusty archives. They are alive. They are the foundations of the institutions we still live with, the source of the inequalities that still plague us, the root of the prejudices that still poison our society. The story of Eleanor Beaumont is not just a Louisiana ghost story. It's the story of a nation's original sin, a sin that has never been fully confessed, never been fully atoned for. The ghosts of the Beaumont plantation are still walking among us. They are in our legal codes, in our economic systems, in the unspoken hierarchies that still govern our lives. We have just learned to call them by different names. The secret was never just about one woman, one family, one crime. It was about a system so powerful and so perverse that it could make a mother sell her child, a doctor harm his patient, and a lawyer defile the law. And until we confront that system, in all its historical and modern forms, we are all still living on the grounds of the Beaumont Plantation, tasting the bitterness in the sugar and pretending not to hear the weeping from the third floor.